tuning in to Legacy Keepers podcast. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host, Kare. And today we have a very special guest. Her name is Anne Neufeld, and she wrote a memoir for her mother-in-law. So it wasn't her own, and so we're going to learn more about the process of writing someone else's memoir today. But Anne, in her 20s, she was a teacher and she loved the English language. She loved writing, teaching English. And I think that began her kind of love for writing, journaling, and in the end, writing this memoir. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. It's good to
Yes,
be with you.
welcome. I'm sorry, say that again?
It's good to be with you.
Yes, and we're thrilled to have you here. I'm going to jump right in because I do have some questions that I want to ask you. I'm super fascinated with Mary's story, and as Anita said, we know that Mary was your mother-in-law. So Mary has a wonderful story, and we want to hear about that. But before we begin, can you, Anne, tell us a little bit about why you decided to write a memoir for your mother-in-law?
Well, I just felt that it was really important for future generations to have some understanding about where they came from, who their forebears were, and how they have been impacted by their predecessors. Our grandchildren have also repeatedly asked us for stories about our past. They have been fascinated by them. And so it's been an ongoing process already for many years to tell the stories verbally, but the time came that it needed to be written down.
Mhm. Oh, you make such a good point. And just as you were saying that, it was tweaking something in me. And I'm remembering of when my children were quite young. They're in their 20s and 30s now. And they used to want me to tell them stories of my childhood all the time. And then I can remember one time my son said to me, he's like, Mom, how come you had so much fun when you were a child and we don't have that kind of fun? But keep in mind the kind of fun that he was talking about was fun where I like nearly died, right? It was like dangerous situations and things like that. And I remember saying to him, well, it's because I lived through those things and survived that you don't get to do that. But the point is, I was like, gosh, I should write all those things down because in my mind, I've said them so many times and I've told people these stories so many times. And yet they're my stories to tell, and I will tell my children those, but that doesn't mean they're going to tell their children. So you make a good
Right.
point about the difference between orally sharing our histories and then actually recording them, in the written word, because that's truly a legacy. So thank you for pointing that out, and I am really glad to know that you've done that. So now the next question is, what about for yourself? Because I have a feeling there's some stories there, and we all think I have nothing to say, but I know that that's not true. So my next question is, will there be a memoir coming where you're the lead character, a story about your life?
I have actually written a story about a good part of my life. It hasn't been published, however. It's on my computer, ready to
Right?
go. But
Okay.
I don't know when the time will be right to get that
Well,
out
you're
there.
saying you've started it. You've started it,
Yes,
and it's
yes.
there. Well,
And
let's talk after. Maybe we can help you with that.
All right, good idea.
but is part of
Thank
the reason
you.
for that is that you find it easier to talk about someone else's story than yourself?
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
Or publish someone else's story? Like, will your secrets come out if you publish while you're
I
living?
probably didn't write all my secrets down. However, no, it's there, and if somebody in the future wants it, I can run with it.
Right. Well, I'm sure someone in the future will want it.
Mm.
Okay,
Yeah.
back to Mary's story. Um, does the memoir that you wrote for her follow a particular theme or time period in her life?
Yes, it does. Um, it focuses on the time when she lived in South Russia, and then because of all the dangerous times that she lived in and the difficult circumstances of the culture of that day, the war, revolution, etc. Um, she then began the journey to leave Russia through Poland, through Germany, and finally come to Canada. And that is a time period that none of us have lived through. My husband was a very small baby at the time, so he has no recollection of that time. So if we don't write these things down, they will be lost.
Right. And you make a good point there about that was a period you didn't live through, so no one else can tell that story really other than her and the people she was with at that time.
That's right.
Mhm.
Well, we learned actually from my own parents' experience that if we don't get these things written down in timely fashion, there comes a time when it's too late.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
Mary herself has died. That opportunity is past. So I'm glad that we were able to get the story from her before she was unable to give it to us.
Okay. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Also, because it was a different country, I'm assuming that's a big part of it as well, because everyone here knows what it's like being in Canada, but we can't relate right now to that.
That's right. Yeah. And
So is
times
that,
were so different then, and there was
Yeah.
just a lot of danger.
yeah. So is
Mhm.
that why you chose that time period in her life? Because it is so different and kind of that would be lost if you hadn't told it?
Yes, it's the time period that our grandchildren would be least likely to know anything about.
Mhm.
And so they would find it fascinating, which they do.
Yeah,
And so it preserves some of that history for them.
great.
Yeah, for sure. And can you tell us about your journey of writing Mary's story or, any other stories maybe that come to mind? But I'm super curious about, were there any challenges that you had, in gathering the information and compiling it and writing it? Just tell us a little bit about how that all worked for you.
Oh, yes, there definitely were challenges. I think what got the ball rolling was a great nephew of Mary's had to write a piece of history for a school assignment. He was fascinated by the stories from Russia. His grandmother actually was Mary's sister and had gone through the same experiences, but she was unable to give the information anymore. So he, together with his dad and his grandfather, got Mary to sit down with them for a 2 hour interview by video, audio, video. And they asked her a lot of questions about her
Love it.
past. And
Yeah.
she told the stories.
Mhm.
However, she got easily distracted and she'd go down one rabbit hole after the other.
Yeah.
So the whole interview, although it provided a lot of information, was not the most cohesive. It was not
Right.
terribly chronological. It was
Right.
bits and pieces over a 2 hour period. The other resources that I used is Mary had been asked on several occasions to give testimonials about her life story. And so, to various groups. And so she had those written down, and I had them all preserved on the computer. So, first of all, I took the video because most of it was in German. I had to transcribe the video, I had to translate it into English. I put it
Wow.
all on the computer along with her testimonials. And thank goodness for the cut and paste feature because I had to rearrange a lot of the information to get it into some sort of flow and
Right.
chronological order
Right.
and try to make some cohesive sense out of the whole thing. It was fascinating. It was a journey of love. I really enjoyed doing it, but it
Yeah.
was quite challenging. Not
You know,
everybody's a really natural, good storyteller.
exactly.
So you have to find a way to make that work. And that
Well,
was my biggest challenge.
And I do appreciate you being honest about what your challenges were. I think that's one of the reasons why Anita, the things that you're identifying here, are among the reasons why Anita and I decided to start Daisy Chain Legacy Publishing, is
Mhm.
because we do have, loved ones and generations, that have already passed on, and we know those stories are getting lost. It's the same way for my own family because my Oma, has died, my mom has died, my mom's sister has died, and all those stories are kind of just, going with them. And that's one of the things that really inspired Anita and I. And then the other thing that inspired us was not just the lost stories, but how difficult it is for just the average person to feel like they can take on a project of this nature,
Right.
and, my hat goes off to you for taking on that project. But I do want to say to our listeners that it's okay if they don't feel that they can take on that level. That's one of the reasons why we're here to kind of to do some of those steps and make sure that those stories don't get lost. So thank you for sharing that because we do know that
Yes.
it can be very overwhelming.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
what year did they do that interview with Mary? Do you remember?
Well, she died in 2008. This would have been probably around the year 2000. I'm not exactly positive right now.
So well into her 80s or 90s?
She was in her 80s, probably for sure.
Yeah. And did you find through the listening to those recordings, was she like happy to share those stories, or was there parts of it that she had forgotten or wanted to forget?
Even though some of the stories brought back some really terrible memories, I think she was realizing that because she's on the other side of it,
Mm,
it has turned into a happy story in the end.
right.
And so she was very happy actually to share. She was very touched that people are interested in hearing these stories and that they're important to the future generations. So
Mm.
she was very happy to cooperate.
And was there a piece of the story that was the most inspiring to you while you were doing all of that? Because I guess you weren't there either, and she's not a direct relative of yours. So you're kind of a objective third party person in some ways.
Yes, there were some very inspiring parts of it. The one thing that comes through loud and clear through the entire story is her very strong faith and how it got her through the difficult times. And she relates in one area of the story when she was in Germany and she got the news that her husband had died in the hard labor camps in Siberia, cold, starved, sick. That really threw her for a loop
Yeah.
spiritually as well.
Yeah.
And she was in the immigration or refugee camp in Germany at the time. And she said that she had been on her knees for many hours that night, just beseeching God, asking Him, "Are you really there? Are you real? Are you for real?" And she came out of that more convinced than ever that her faith was well placed. And she raised her children in a very strong faith because of what she had come through. In addition to that, through all their difficult times, she was always very positive and determined that things were going to work out well. And she made that happen with the help of other people and through the help of God. But the one thing that has struck me over and over is how many times she and her sisters and her nieces and nephews would sing their way through the difficult times. They loved to sing, and that singing got them through so many difficult times. So, those are some of the things that have particularly inspired me about her story.
What a great legacy to leave, even just the singing part and the overcoming part, right?
Mhm.
So,
It is.
yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, it's okay. You go ahead.
I was going to ask, do you think Mary would be happy with the way that this story's been shared and having this story out there for her, generations to come.
I think she'd be somewhat amused that people are actually interested in her story.
Yeah.
But yes, I think she would be very pleased.
Mhm.
And she would just want it to be glory to God that their story is out there and inspiring not only her family, but other people as well.
That's so interesting that you said that she would be amused because it's so true when we live through something ourselves, even though to others that may sound like amazing or adventurous or horrific or whatever it is. But when it's us going through it, we just think it's our life, right? And why would
That's
anyone
right.
else be interested in that? And so I think that's another good point to make with writing it down because we don't always think we have a story. We think it's just, well, that was just my life. Why does anyone
Yes.
care? Uh,
Right.
and yet when we write it down and we read someone else's story, we're like, wow, she went through all of that. That's amazing.
Mhm.
Yes, and I think so many of us, of later generations, when it comes to, the world wars and, civil unrest and uh, terrible things that happen in life, but many generations before ours, we tend to think of those things or we get exposed to them in textbooks, or, kind of in a very flat way that doesn't really bring the emotion of what was really happening for the people who are experiencing them. And so I know when I was, reading Mary's story, and, as you know, I helped to compile it into a shorter version and going through some of those things. It was very impactful for me to read and be involved in the words that were there and sort of put them together in a different way because there is so much emotion, there's so much impact, there's so much things within Mary's story that people like myself and in generations to come will never experience. So knowing that, my question for you, Anne, is how do you feel about the concept of Mary's story now being a legacy, especially when we consider the fact that she overcame so much, that she demonstrated the ability of women, especially to come together and just get stuff done. And then when you're thinking about the generations that come next, like your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, how I want to know is how do you feel about this legacy being created in this way?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I see so many of Mary's traits surfacing in my children, my grandchildren, and hopefully someday I'll see them in my great grandchildren also. They have definitely been very impacted by her life and by her character. And I think it's really good for them to realize where some of these things came from. And she was such a good role model for them and showed them how to be strong and move forward in a positive way. And I think it also engenders gratitude because, first of all, coming to Canada was not a given. There are a lot of people who didn't make it to Canada who wanted to be here. So we're grateful for the country that took us in. And Mary and her descendants have become excellent contributing citizens of this country. And I think we need to never forget that that is a privilege and that has come about because of this legacy. So I'm very thankful that we do have it written down.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think it's wonderful that the grandchildren of Mary, her great grandchildren, and many other generations that are yet to even come, will now be able to read her story, and they will maybe be able to understand the sacrifices, that she went through, that her family went through, and then, like you said, and understand some level of gratitude, and not take advantage of, the freedoms, because that's an important part. It's hard to convey that to future generations, but I think with Mary's story there is the potential. For our
I
listeners,
just wanted
and I'm
to,
just going.
sorry, Kara, I just wanted to ask, I know before we started the recording, you shared a little story about your grandson naming his son after Oma's husband because of reading this story. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, my grandson was so impacted by the stories of his great grandfather, David Neufeld, and what an honorable man he was, in that he would not betray his neighbor, even though it meant that he himself would be imprisoned to hard labor. And so when his firstborn son came into the world, he was named. His second name is David, after his grandfather, well, great great grandfather for the little boy. And so someday that little boy is going to grow up and he's going to know the story about why his second name is David,
I love
and
that. I love that
be
because
able
that's a,
to look up to his one of his forefathers.
yeah, I mean, that's such a tangible expression of the results of writing a memoir, right? Like if
Yes,
that story hadn't been written and your grandson didn't know that, his child might have a different name. And so
right.
those are really tangible things that can come as a result of having this in writing.
Yes,
And now I just want to make sure that our listeners understand that, Anne and her family before her, created a lot of raw data through different writings and videos and audio and different things like that. And then, Daisy Chain Legacy Publishing sort of got that, and we sort of compiled that, and rewrote it in a different way. And then what we ended up with is, a memoir for Mary Neufeld called Nowhere to Land, A Story of Faith, Family, and a Quest for Freedom. But it's only about 5,000 words, and we originally got about 13,000 words from you, Anne. And I just want to know, and you can go ahead and be honest here, do you feel like the story, that Mary's story, was preserved in the shorter version? And how do you feel about that finished product?
oh, I feel very good about it. I thought it was well done. It preserved all the important parts of it.
Right,
Obviously, you can't put in all the detail in a shortened version.
right.
But I know one of my grandsons, for instance, given the opportunity to choose between reading the long version or the short version, chose the short version because that's all the time he had. They're
Mhm.
all at that age now where they're busy with their careers and social life and raising families. They don't have time to sit down and read a lot of pages about things that they know very little about,
Mhm.
but they will sit down and read an abridged version or a condensed version that still gives them all the pertinent information, and um, even conveys the feelings, the emotions through that condensed version that will be meaningful and impactful to themselves. So I'm
Yeah.
very grateful that there is this opportunity for them to read a shortened version of their great grandmother's story, and
Oh,
that
that's
will have
wonderful.
meaning for them as a result.
That's wonderful. And I'm actually really glad to hear that. And you raise a really good point just about attention spans and how people receive information. And if we can create something for people that kind of will give them the information in the way they are willing and able to receive it, then I see that as a win-win for everybody. So thank you for sharing that. I personally have one more question for you. And I want to know, would you encourage someone to write their own memoir before they're no longer capable? Would you encourage somebody to jump into the process and just go ahead and get it done?
100%. I think it's a very valuable exercise for the person himself or herself, as well as for the readers who will eventually read that. It is a wonderful thing to be able to take stock and pass on relevant things to the people that we love.
Yeah. Well, I firmly believe that everyone has a story to tell. Everyone has at least one story to tell, if not several.
Right.
And I personally, want to do whatever part I can to make sure that we get as many of those stories written as possible.
Mhm.
And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a little teaser paragraph from the memoir. Maybe it'll encourage them to want to read the whole thing because I know as I was reading it, I couldn't stop reading because there was just so many things to learn from it and emotions that came up while reading it was amazing. So do you have a little excerpt you can share with us?
I do. The trauma and difficulties of war were an everyday occurrence when I was a child. World War I, which began in 1914, lasted more than 4 years. During World War I, after Lenin Bolsheviks seized power, the Russian Civil War began, leading to a revolution. When the anti-Bolshevik White Army fighting against the community, with the anti-Bolshevik White Army fighting against the Communist Red Army, it was a time of mass terror, especially for Mennonites and Jews. Peasant farmers, including my family and all the other residents of Hamburg, were forced to hand over their hard-earned food supply to the army. Often, entire towns and cities were taken over by the military, leaving people with nowhere to go. On top of that, bandits raided villages, stole food and goods, and killed many innocent people. These anarchist bands, led by Nestor Makhno, specifically targeted Mennonite villages because we were prosperous. We never knew when an attack would come.
And I guess those attacks did come. So you'll have to read the whole story in order to find out what happened.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing that. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.